بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. So we had gotten to the fourth hadith. This hadith is a hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. He is one of the mukthirun we talked about, I think, last week. The mukthirun are the 7 companions who narrated over 1,000 hadith each. And we are indebted to them for having as much of the sunnah preserved as we have. By the way, in the Q&A section of the class, we have a question about the preservation of the Quran, inshallah. So we'll get around to that, just to dangle that as a teaser. So Jabir is number 6 on the list of mukthirun. He has narrated about 1,500 hadith from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Does anybody, real quick, remember anybody else on that list of 7? Who were the companions who narrated most of the sunnah, or we should say a really substantial chunk of the sunnah? المكثرون في رواية الخبر. Oh, yeah, mashallah, we have an Arabic speaker. So now I can give you the line of poetry, how you can remember it. المكثرون في رواية الخبر من الصحابة الأكارم الأبر أبو هريرة يليه ابن عمر فأنس فزوجة الهادي الأبر. So we have Abu Huraira, Ibn Umar, Anas, Aisha, right in the middle, number 4. We talked about her last week. ثم ابن عباس يليه جابر. What's the... وبعده الخضري وهو الآخر. Yeah, that's right. So then we have Ibn Abbas and Jabir and finally Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Anyway, so what about Jabir? What do we know about Jabir? He's al-Ansari, which means he's from Medina. He accepted Islam as a boy with his father, whose name is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn Haram, at the house of Aqaba in Mecca. So they were some of the group of Ansaris from Medina who traveled to Mecca and actually gave the pledge to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam in Mecca. It's a really interesting kind of family history he has, because his father prohibited him from fighting in the battles of Badr and Uhud. Why? Because he had 9 sisters, mashallah, tabarakallah. And so he was the only boy. And so his father commanded him to stay home, not to fight, because he wanted him to stay alive and take care of them, and should anything happen to him. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about mirath, when we talked about inheritance law, and the importance of kind of not just picking and choosing, but implementing the whole system of Islam, which is raising our sons to be responsible, right? To be responsible for our daughters if push comes to shove. God forbid anything happen to your husbands or to the other male relatives of your family, your sons have to be prepared and ready to step in and take charge and protect and provide, right, for your daughters after they're gone. And so this is exactly the situation that Jabir was in. He had 9 sisters, and he was responsible for them. So his father prohibited him from taking part in the battles of Badr and Uhud. This also proves another principle of Islamic law, which is important to keep in mind, which is that specific situations override general principles, right? We see this all the time in fiqh discussions or stuff like that, especially that happen on the internet. People will use very general hadith or very general ayats from the Quran to justify something, and that's good, that's evidence. But if there's something specific that overrides it, then guess what? The specific overrides it. And so all of the hadith and the ayats from the Quran that we have about the praiseworthiness of a valid, just jihad, which is true, get overridden by this more specific concern, which is your responsibility to your family, especially to the women folk. So after his father passed away and his sisters grew up and got married, Jabir then started fighting the battles with the rest of the Muslims, and he never missed a single one after that with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, which is an illustration of the hadith from last week, which we said how, but there's jihad left after the hijrah, after the fath, after the conquest of Mecca. There's no hijrah, external hijrah, but there is jihad and niyyah. So Jabir got both because he had his intention, he had his niyyah for fighting in the battle of Badr and Uhud. Even though he wasn't able to go, he was still rewarded for as if he had, because he had a legitimate excuse. And then he was able to also fight after that. And so he got both. After the death of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, Jabir fought in the conquest of Sham. And then after that, he returned to Medina to teach the Sunnah, to teach the Hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and to give fatwa. So Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari was one of the muftis of Medina during his time. And some of the scholars say that he was the last companion to die in Medina. There's basically a little bit of a difference whether it was him or Sahl ibn Sa'd, but he was one of the very last companions to die in Medina, certainly. So the text of the hadith, we have Jabir radiallahu anhuma said, we accompanied the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam in an expedition, he means a military campaign, when he said to us, there are some men back in Medina who are with you wherever you march and whichever valley you cross. They have not joined you in person because of their illness. And in another version, he said they share the reward with you. So this is very much a more specific kind of version of what we talked about last week. Deeds or actions that are left undone for valid excuses, you will still get rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's part of his unique mercy, right? I mean, we hardly thank people who do things for us, let alone the people who intended to do things for us and ended up being prevented from doing those things. I'm more likely to criticize that person and say, oh, but you didn't, let's look at the results, like what actually happened. You didn't actually come through. While when it comes to our spiritual universe, Allah is much more merciful, of course, than we are. And so he's kind of developed, or he's created, let's say, this system where you're rewarded not just for the actions that you do, but you're rewarded for the actions that you don't do if you sincerely intend them and then are prevented from doing them. What this doesn't mean, this is like, we have to draw a distinction between like a valid excuse that prevents you from doing it, either physically or financially or morally, like in the case of Jabir not going to fight because of his sisters, versus kind of what's wishful thinking, right? Because we have, not to get into politics at all, but, with the whole Joe Biden, inshallah moment, right? We kind of, as the Muslim community, have this stereotype, or this tendency, to kind of, inshallah, I'll see you there, inshallah, we don't really, when we say that, we're not really intending to follow through on it, right? And so this is a problem, right? We've kind of soiled the expression, inshallah, a little bit in popular culture. That Biden would even think to say such a thing is indicative of that. But even more so, this type of loose, inshallah, I don't really intend to do it, is an example of wishful thinking that doesn't come under this hadith, right? So people can change their intentions. I could intend to do something good, and then I could get lazy, or I could, just, I don't know, something could happen where we were talking, I think, a couple lessons ago about, especially between spouses or anybody that you're close to, where these kinds of interpersonal dynamics can really mess up your deeds, right? It's like you are about to do something that will help somebody, and then you get in a fight, you get in an argument, they say something that's not very nice to you, and then all of a sudden you don't want to do it anymore, and you don't. Whether that thing was a certain chore or a task that you have to do at home, or just a certain level of care and compassion and involvement that you kind of are committed to giving to that person. And so how this sort of situation isn't really covered by this hadith, because your intention is changing, right? You had the intention to do the dishes because your spouse had a really hard day at work, and then he said something that made you mad, and now you're not doing it anymore. Well, we can't say that, his blunder, even if it was a blunder, prevented you, right, from doing that thing, and so you're going to get the reward of intending it anyway. No, it doesn't really work like that. You kind of changed your intention to do that thing, which is a little bit different. So this hadith is very straightforward. That's the hadith. We have 5 more minutes before questions. I will try to go through the next hadith so we can kind of get some ground under our feet. The next hadith is on the related from a companion by the name of Ma'an ibn Yazid ibn al-Akhnas, not a very famous companion at all. And we say radiyallahu anhum when we say his name, because he's one of the rare companions who, him and his father and his grandfather all accepted Islam. And they are the only 3-generation trio to all fight together on the side of the Muslims in the Battle of Badr. So you have son, father, and grandson all accepting Islam, all taking part in Badr. That's the only family like that. Ma'an, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, played a big part in the conquests of Egypt and Syria. He was one of the people that Umar radiallahu anhu relied upon. He took part in the Battle of Siffin on the side of Muawiyah, if you guys, any of you are Islamic history buffs. And he was killed in the battle supporting al-Dhahak against Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Again, that's a lot of history there. We don't have time to go into it. But if some of you know kind of the major events of the first 100 or so years of Islamic history, that should be interesting to you. This text of the hadith, he says, my father set aside some money for charity, and he gave that money to a man in the masjid to take care of the distribution, right? So he appoints one of his friends in the masjid to distribute this money. Okay. The man then says, I went to the masjid looking for some charity, and that man gave it to me. Okay, so you see what happened here. His father gave charity to somebody else, not because that person number 2 needed it, but to distribute to those who are needy. And his son was needy and went to the masjid and then ended up taking that same money, right? So when they kind of realized what had happened, obviously in a normal situation, this isn't something that you can do, because your family members are part of your normal responsibility anyway, right? You can't give your zakat, for example, to your wife or to your daughter or your son, or your parents, right? You can't do that according to the vast majority of scholars, because these are people who are your responsibility to take care of in the first place, right? Zakat has to be for others. So the situation kind of happened. And so they went to the Prophet ﷺ, and they asked him what they should do. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said to the father, he said, you have been rewarded for what you've intended. And he said to the son, Ma'an, he said, you are entitled to what you have taken. So this is a really interesting situation with a couple interesting lessons. First of all, obviously the relevance of the chapter, or the relevance of this hadith in the chapter, is that actions are judged by their intentions, right? This is another illustration that kind of shines a light on the border or the contour of this situation, when it applies and when it doesn't apply. So even though this situation, if he had given his money to his son directly, it would not have counted for zakah. But because he intended it and he gave it to a wakil, somebody to give it out on his behalf, and it happened to go to his son, he's rewarded according to his intention and not according to just the cold hard facts of the case. Similarly, the son took it not knowing that it was his father's money, and so he is entitled to what he had. He intended no, he wasn't trying to cut corners. He wasn't trying to kind of get over on anybody. And so both of them were rewarded with something. That's the first thing from this hadith. The second, and maybe the more important thing, and I'll try to be brief so we can get to the questions, is that they both went to arbitration to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a father and a son, right? And we know how generally in Muslim culture, we could even say Islamic culture, because it is from Islam, the parents are to be obeyed, right? The default relationship is one of respect and obedience to the parents, unless the parents try to get one of the children to do something that's not permissible in the religion, right? So if the son takes the father to the Prophet ﷺ, in some households that would be seen today as disrespect, would it not? It's not quite like calling the cops on your parents, right? But there's some aspect of it that has a similarity. The Prophet ﷺ is the Prophet ﷺ. He gets revelation from Allah. He's qadi. He's like the judge of the community. You're taking your father to the judge, right? It's a little bit uncomfortable, but the father doesn't disagree. He doesn't say, no, this is disrespect. You have to listen to me. You have to whatever. No, he's like, okay, yeah, let's go. Let's see what the right thing is to do. And that's the key there, is that the parent wants to do the right thing and the son wants to do the right thing. Neither of them are taking each other to the Prophet ﷺ in order to kind of like take something. Like, I want this, give it to me. No, they both want to do the right thing. And one of the things that I thought about when reading this hadith is the power of shifting our children's obedience from obeying us to obeying Allah and Islam. Because if you make your children's obedience just about obeying you, what I say, what I want, when I want it, I say jump, you say how high, these sorts of things, then what will likely happen, well, let's just put it this way. What happens to your child when they move out? Or when your child gets married and is no longer under your authority? Is that child going to maintain that relationship of obedience? Are they going to kind of finally feel free and go wild and crazy because now they have you out of their hair, right? Are they going to have any process of redress if they think that you're wrong or doing something that's not fair or unjust? Big questions. Children, especially in the United States of America, are very sensitive to something they perceive as unjust. It's not fair. That's not fair. That's not fair. If it's about you and obeying me, because I'm the father, I'm the mother, I'm the boss of the family, then you always kind of leave yourself open to souring this kind of relationship. However, if you make Islam the constitution between you, and you say, okay, listen, if there is something that I do that's against Islam, then you have to tell me and correct me. And if there's something you do that's against Islam, then I'm going to tell you and you have to listen too. Then you've kind of shifted the place of authority to outside both of you. It's no longer you against them. It's both of you working together trying to find out what is it that Allah wants. Now, obviously, this isn't going to work with every single situation, like when, if you have a bedtime or a certain time you want to eat, right? But it can help. It can help with their general relationship to authority, their general kind of relationship to obedience, and it can set them up to realize that all human beings, we're all just servants of Allah, and so we're kind of all in this together, trying to live in ever increasing obedience to our Creator, trying to improve every day, every year. And Allah knows best. So, alhamdulillah, we got through 2 hadith. Let's go to the questions. First question, when was the Quran written down? And if anybody has any other questions, you can throw them in the chat box or anything. When was the Quran written down? So the Quran was sent down. How was it communicated to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam? Was by recitation. Jibreel alayhi salam recited it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There were some verses of the Quran where the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam was given the revelation directly. He compared it to the ringing of a bell. However, every single year during Ramadan, Jibreel would come and review the Quran with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. This is part of how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew when he was about to die, because Jibreel reviewed it with him twice in the last year of his life. He kind of understood that this was going to be it. So there were dozens of companions who had memorized the entire Quran during the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there were a handful to several, depending on how you define those words, who wrote down the Quran with their hands. Keep in mind, this is 7th century Arabia. Most people are not literate. There is no paper. There is no ink like that, right? So writing materials are very, very scarce. But despite that, large portions of the Quran were written down. They would write them down on bones, especially like the shoulder blade bone of animals and camels, because it's big and kind of flat. They would write them on leather. If they had it, they would write it on rocks, and even on pieces of bark from the date palm tree. Okay, but there was no one book that was the Quran during the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you have dozens of companions who memorized all of it, and then you have different pieces of it written down in different places that is kind of distributed amongst the companions. And then the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam dies. Within the next leader of the Muslims is obviously Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr reigns for 2 years. He leads the Muslim community for 2 years. Within that 2 years, the companions start to realize the importance of putting the Quran, compiling it into one book. And they really start to realize this importance when many of the companions who had memorized the entire Quran start to pass away in some of the battles and things like that. So Umar suggests to Abu Bakr, he says, listen, why don't we write this whole thing down? We put it in a book, and then we have it, it will be, taken, preserved. Abu Bakr at first is initially reluctant to do it. He thinks, well, I'm not sure the Prophet ﷺ didn't have this done. But then he realizes that this is fulfilling a goal of the Sharia. This is not an innovation. It's nothing that is problematic from a religious perspective. It's simply fulfilling a goal of the Sharia. It's a very important concept in fiqh. People talk about innovation, innovation, innovation. There are certain things that the Prophet ﷺ never did, but they fulfill a goal of the Sharia, and so they are not considered an innovation. That's another discussion. That's a long discussion. Anyway, so what they did was they created a committee led by Zayd ibn Thabit, who was an expert in the Quran, and they gathered everybody who had memorized the Quran, either all of it or parts of it, and they gathered all of the written copies that they could find, and they compiled it and reviewed it and cross-examined everybody until they had their final copy compilation of the Quran. And this was done, like I said, within 2 years of the Prophet ﷺ's death. That copy was kept by Abu Bakr until he died. After Abu Bakr died, he gave it to, after he died, it passed on to Umar. After Umar was assassinated, it passed on to his daughter Hafsa. After Hafsa, during the time it was with Hafsa, Uthman became the leader. And during that period, Islam had spread to many places that didn't speak Arabic at all. And so what they found was people were starting to make very, very bad mistakes when they recited the Quran, to the point that it was changing the meaning completely. And so that was when Uthman summoned Hafsa and summoned that authoritative copy of the Quran. He made 7 copies of it. He sent those copies out to the main centers of the Muslim world at the time. And then from there, they were further copied. Those copies, there's debate as to whether they still exist or not. There are some that are candidates, like the one in Topkapı Palace in Istanbul in Turkey. There's one in Uzbekistan that is a candidate. You know, it's kind of like people think that it could be one of those original copies that Uthman had commissioned, but there's not certainty about it. Either way, there are, other than those copies, which are thought to be the copies of Uthman, there are over 50 manuscripts of the Quran that are carbon dated to within 100 years of the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. How much of the Quranic text, because all of these are incomplete, how much of the Quranic text does it represent? It represents over 96% of the entire Quran. There's just a couple verses missing here and there. So are there any differences between those manuscripts and what we have today? No, not at all. 100% zero, right? If we compare this to another book, we compare this to the New Testament, for example, and I actually had a long discussion with some evangelicals one time, and I didn't even know this stuff until they were coming at me, and I researched into it. So compare that to the New Testament. What do we have of the New Testament? In the New Testament, the only manuscripts that exist that can be carbon dated to within 100 years of the time of Isa alayhi salam, there's only 4 of them, compared to over 50 for the Quran. There have lots of manuscripts that are after that, like within 200 or within 300 years. But when it comes to within 100 years, there's only 4. How complete are these 4 manuscripts? How much of the New Testament do they represent? They represent a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the New Testament, less than 1%. So the oldest manuscript that exists is actually just the size of a business card. It has a single verse from John, from the Gospel of John, written on it. So all this to say that if you come from it from a textual preservation perspective, there's nothing like the Quran. There's nothing that exists like the Quran. Actually, I got into this discussion because the evangelicals were trying to tell me that the New Testament is preserved better than like Plato and Socrates. I said, okay, well, how well is it preserved? Let's compare it to the Quran. And so I kind of strung them up by their own rope, if you will, because by their own criteria, the Quran is preserved in a more authentic way. I could talk about that for a long time. We have 5 minutes left. Next question is, how did Adam's children reproduce? That is a good question. It's a provocative question. What if someone says that, okay, you believe in Adam and all this stuff. Okay, he had children. How are they going to produce? Isn't that incest? You guys like incest in your Islamic Muslim religion, right? Well, here's the thing. Adam had children in pairs of twins, okay? So he would have twins, boy, girl, twins, boy, girl, twins, boy, girl. There's no one else on earth when it comes to humans. So the Sharia that Allah gave Adam was to marry the boys with the girls that weren't twins. right? And that is how they reproduced. And if that seems strange to you, and if that seems disgusting, then we have to have a larger conversation about law, about Allah's law, and what Allah's law is here for, right? We know that this sort of thing would be prohibited to us, right? And we know that this sort of thing was prohibited to every other prophet from Nuh on down. But it was made permissible because of the dire necessity that faced Adam and his children. If you're looking for a comparable example, we would say, isn't it allowed to eat pork if you're in the desert or in the wilderness and you're about to starve? Aren't you allowed to then eat pork to save yourself? The answer is yes, you are. Yes, you are. Because al-darura tubihu al-mahdhurat. There's a principle in Islamic law that dire necessity, life or death, makes permissible things that are otherwise not permissible. And this is exactly an example of that. So we have our entire deen is made up of two parts, okay? There's theology, al-aqidah, and there's law, the sharia. The sharia is really for us. It's for our own benefit, right? And because it's for our own benefit, it changes from prophet to prophet. It doesn't change 180 degrees, but it changes a little bit, right? There were previous nations who were allowed to drink alcohol. There were previous nations that were allowed to, do other things that we're not allowed to do. And vice versa. You find, like, for example, dietary laws for the Jews were much more strict than for the Muslims, right? So law changes from community to community. And even within a even within a community, like, for example, when it comes to the prohibition of alcohol, it did not come overnight. It came very slowly in stages. Or the obligation of the hijab, it came slowly. It did not come all at once, right? So when it comes to law, law is tailored to human need. Human need changes, not fundamentally, but circumstantially. And so there can be changes between nations and things like that. So this sort of thing shouldn't surprise us. However, when it comes to theology, when it comes to the nature of Allah, who to worship, right? These are issues that have to do with capital T truth, right? And so these are issues that don't change, not between prophets, not within one prophet's mission, right? And so if somebody ever approaches you, if they're a Christian, for example, and they look at you funny because we say that, what we would call incest today was allowed to the children of Adam so that they could procreate, then you could easily turn it back on them and say, you guys believe in a Trinitarian theology that you can't find any other prophet preaching. If you look in the first 5 books of the Bible, you can't find Moses preaching a Trinitarian theology. So why did that change? Isn't that supposed to be the nature of truth? If God is really 3, wouldn't Moses have had to know that? Wouldn't he have had to preach that in order to save himself and the children of Israel? Yes. And so a very uncomfortable question that Christians don't have an answer to is if you say to them, did Moses believe in the Trinity? They won't be able to answer. If they say yes, then you say, where? where in the Bible does he believe in the Trinity? And if they say no, then you say, well, then according to you, he should be in the hellfire, because according to your interpretation of the New Testament, you believe that anybody who doesn't believe in the Trinity is going to hell. Anyway, so that's that. So we have Sharia and Aqidah. We have law and theology. Law changes according to human need. Aqidah does not change ever because it has to do with the reality. And Allah has never sent a messenger except that he has preached Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and asked us to worship only Allah. We're 30 seconds away from this thing shutting off. So first of all, thank you everybody for your participation. It was a great lesson. I enjoy our Thursday sessions. Oh, next week we have a different thing to do. There's a special event on the Uyghur Muslims. I'm going to send you the link in the women's WhatsApp group.